It is the morning of March 12, 1928, deep inside the rugged terrain of San Francisquito Canyon, 40 miles north of Los Angeles. Two men stand atop a massive curved wall of white concrete. Beneath their feet, 12.5 billion gallons of water press against the barrier, a man-made lake stretching 3 miles back into the mountain. The older man is William Mulholland. He is the chief engineer of the Los Angeles Bureau of Waterworks and Supply. He is the most powerful, respected, and beloved civil servant in California. Beside him is his trusted assistant, Harvey Van Norman. They have driven up the canyon in a rush this morning because the dam keeper, a man named Tony Harnischfeger, called them with a terrifying report. The dam is leaking. Leaks in a new concrete dam are not entirely unusual. Concrete cures, it shifts, it settles. But Harnischfeger noticed something different about this leak. The water trickling from the western abutment of the dam was muddy. Muddy water leaking from a dam is the ultimate red flag in civil engineering. It means the foundation itself, the very earth holding the structure in place, is washing away. It means the dam is bleeding. Mulholland walks the face of the structure. He is a self-taught genius, a man who has read engineering textbooks by candlelight, a man who has bent rivers to his will. He inspects the leak. He looks at the water. He looks at the surrounding hillsides. After a careful examination, Mulholland makes a calculation based on 40 years of experience. He concludes that the mud is not coming from the dam's foundation. He decides it is merely dirt washing down from a nearby construction road, mixing with a normal, clear water leak. He tells the dam keeper not to worry. The dam is safe. Mulholland and his assistant get back into their chauffeur-driven car and begin the 2-hour drive back to the bustling, thirsty metropolis of Los Angeles. 12 hours later, the dam will be gone. 12 hours later, a wall of water 10 stories high will obliterate the canyon, wiping entire towns off the map, washing hundreds of sleeping people into the Pacific Ocean, and effectively ending the career of the man who built modern Los Angeles. The collapse of the St. Francis Dam remains the deadliest civil engineering failure in American history. It is a story of profound tragedy, but it is not merely a story of a broken wall. It is the story of a city's desperate thirst, the limits of human ambition, and a fatal blind spot in the mind of a genius. To understand how William Mulholland could stand on a doomed structure and declare it safe, you have to understand the immense pressure he carried on his shoulder. You have to understand what water meant to Los Angeles. At the dawn of the 20th century, Los Angeles was a rapidly growing town with a massive problem. It had the climate of paradise, the soil of an agricultural empire, and the real estate ambitions of a world-class metropolis. What it did not have was rain. Los Angeles is essentially a desert basin. The local Los Angeles River was entirely inadequate to support the millions of people that civic boosters dreamed of attracting. Without water, Los Angeles was destined to remain a dusty outpost. It would never rival San Francisco. It would never become an empire. Enter William Mulholland. Born in Ireland, Mulholland arrived in Los Angeles in 1877 as a 22-year-old sailor. He took a job digging wells and clearing the city's open water ditches, earning $1.50 a day. He lived in a wooden shack at the bend of the river, but Mulholland was brilliant. He taught himself mathematics, geology, and hydraulics. He rose from ditch tender to superintendent, eventually becoming the chief engineer of the city's water system. Mulholland realized that if Los Angeles could not find water locally, it would have to steal it from somewhere else. He looked 233 miles north to the Owens Valley, a lush agricultural region fed by the snowmelt of the eastern Sierra Nevada. In an audacious, highly controversial, and politically ruthless maneuver, Los Angeles bought up the water rights in the Owens Valley. Mulholland then designed and built the Los Angeles Aqueduct, an engineering marvel that channeled an entire river across the Mojave Desert, through mountains, and down into the San Fernando Valley. When the aqueduct opened in 1913, 30,000 people gathered to watch the water cascade down the mountainside. Mulholland stood before the crowd, pointed to the rushing water, and delivered one of the most famous, succinct speeches in California history. There it is, take it. Overnight, William Mulholland became a god in Los Angeles. He was the man who brought the water. He was the man who made the future possible. The city trusted him implicitly. If the chief said a project was necessary, the city funded it. If the chief said a structure was safe, the city believed him. But the Owens Valley farmers did not accept their fate quietly. By the 1920s, as their farms dried up and their economy collapsed, they began a campaign of armed resistance. They took over aqueduct gates, they stockpiled weapons, and they began using dynamite to blow up portions of Mulholland's aqueduct. The sabotage terrified Los Angeles city officials. If the aqueduct was severed for a prolonged period, the city would dry up. Los Angeles had essentially no emergency storage. They needed a reservoir close to the city, capable of holding a year's supply of water. Mulholland moved quickly. He chose a site he had surveyed years earlier, San Francisquito Canyon. It was a steep, rugged V-shaped canyon, perfectly situated along the route of the aqueduct. Construction of the St. Francis Dam began in 1924. Mulholland designed a concrete gravity arch dam. The principle was simple. The sheer weight and mass of the concrete would hold back the water, while the curved shape would push the immense water pressure outward into the canyon walls. But Mulholland made a series of quiet, fateful decisions during the design and construction process. As the population of Los Angeles continued to explode, the city's thirst grew. During construction, Mulholland decided to raise the height of the dam by 10 feet to increase the reservoir's capacity. A year later, he raised it another 10 feet. The dam eventually reached a height of nearly 200 feet. In engineering, if you raise the height of a gravity dam, you must proportionally widen its base to support the additional mass and water pressure. Mulholland did not widen the base, he simply added to the top. He was confident in his design, and because of his immense stature, no independent state agencies were required to review his plans. Los Angeles law exempted the water department from outside engineering oversight. Mulholland answered only to himself. But the greatest flaw of the St. Francis Dam was not the concrete, it was the earth upon which the concrete was poured. Mulholland was entirely self-taught in geology. He surveyed the canyon walls and determined the bedrock was solid. He was wrong. The eastern canyon wall was made of a metamorphic rock called Pelona schist, which featured microscopic layers that easily peeled apart, slick with talc. Worse, the western canyon wall was composed of the Sespe Formation, a reddish conglomerate rock, and running right down the center of the canyon floor. Separating these two incompatible rock types was an ancient geological fault line. The site was a geological trap. A modern geologist, looking at the canyon, would instantly recognize it as the site of an ancient, massive paleo landslide. The most fatal characteristic of the red Sespe conglomerate on the western wall was completely unknown to Mulholland. If you take a dry piece of this rock, it feels as hard as granite. It requires a heavy blow from a hammer to break. But if you take that same rock and drop it into a glass of water, something terrifying happens. Within an hour, the rock softens, slakes, and dissolves into mud. Mulholland was anchoring a 200-foot dam, designed to hold back 12 billion gallons of water into a mountain that dissolved when wet. By early March 1928, the reservoir was filled to capacity for the first time. The water level sat just inches below the spillway. The immense weight of the lake, roughly 100 billion pounds of pressure, was pressing against the concrete and the canyon walls. The warning signs began to multiply. Deep cracks appeared on the face of the dam. Harnischfeger, the dam keeper, dutifully patched them with oakum, a tarred fiber used in shipbuilding. The canyon walls began to seep water. Then, a new crack appeared on the western abutment, the side anchored to the dissolving red rock. This brings us back to the morning of March 12. Harnischfeger calls Mulholland. Mulholland inspects the muddy leak. Why did Mulholland miss the danger? Because he suffered from the ultimate hubris of the self-made expert. He had spent his entire life conquering nature. He trusted his own eyes over the growing evidence. He saw mud, but he reasoned it away as construction debris. He looked at the mountain, but he could not see beneath the surface. He walked away from the dam, returning to his office in downtown Los Angeles, utterly confident in his creation. As the sun set over San Francisquito Canyon, the temperature dropped. The wind picked up, howling through the narrow gorge. At the base of the dam, a quarter-mile downstream, sat the dam keeper's cottage. Tony Harnischfeger was there with his girlfriend and his 6-year-old son. A mile further down the canyon was Powerhouse Number 2, a hydroelectric plant powered by the aqueduct's flow. Clustered around the powerhouse was a small, vibrant community of utility workers and their families. Children were sleeping in their beds. Women were reading in their living rooms. Men were preparing for the night shift. Further down the canyon, in a wide, flat area, a temporary construction camp housed roughly 140 laborers employed by the Southern California Edison Company. They were sleeping in canvas tents. At 11:57 p.m., the earth finally gave way. There were no eyewitnesses to the exact moment of failure who lived to tell the tale. Geological evidence suggests that the western abutment, the dissolving red rock, failed first. The mountain simply washed out from under the concrete. The dam lost its anchor. Millions of tons of concrete collapsed. Instantly, the pressure shifted, and the eastern abutment, built on the slick, unstable schist, shattered and slid down the canyon wall. The center of the dam, an isolated block of concrete standing over 100 feet tall, remained upright. It would later become known as the Tombstone. 12.5 billion gallons of water plunged down the narrow canyon. It was not a flood. It was an inland tsunami, a liquid avalanche of water, mud, concrete, and pulverized rock. The wave was estimated to be 140 feet high. It struck the dam keeper's cottage first. Tony Harnischweger and his family were obliterated in a fraction of a second. Their bodies were never found. The wave, traveling at 18 miles per hour, rushed toward powerhouse number 2. Inside the plant, an operator noticed a sudden, violent drop in water pressure on his gauges, followed immediately by a deafening roar. He had seconds to react. The wave struck the concrete powerhouse, snapping it off its foundation and crushing the surrounding homes. The community of 28 families was wiped completely off the map. Only 3 people from the powerhouse community survived. The floodwaters roared on, picking up hundreds of thousands of tons of debris. It swallowed massive oak trees whole. It tumbled blocks of dam concrete, weighing 10,000 tons down the canyon like dice. Minutes later, it hit the Edison workers' camp. The men sleeping in their canvas tents never stood a chance. The water consumed them in the dark. Out of 140 men, more than 100 perished instantly. The wave burst out of the narrow confines of San Francisquito Canyon and slammed into the Santa Clara River Valley, making a sharp right turn toward the Pacific Ocean. The flood widened, stretching up to 2 miles across, a churning black soup of mud, timber, barbed wire, and shattered homes. It was now moving toward the sleeping agricultural towns of Ventura County, Castaic Junction, Piru, Fillmore, Bardsdale, Santa Paula. In the dead of night, the telephone lines began to ring. Night watchmen, railway workers, and highway patrolmen who had seen or heard the approaching darkness began frantically calling the towns downstream. In Santa Paula, 2 telephone operators, Louise Geep and Thornton Edwards, received the frantic warning. They did not flee. They stayed at their switchboards, calling every home they could reach, telling the residents to get to high ground. Motorcycle police officers rode into the dark, sirens wailing, knocking on doors, dragging people from their beds just minutes before the water arrived. Their heroism saved hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. But for many, the warning came too late. The water tore through the citrus groves of Santa Paula. It filled the streets with thick, suffocating mud. Homes were lifted from their foundations and floated away like toy boats, often with entire families still trapped on the roofs. The terror lasted for hours. The flood carried its victims 54 miles to the sea. It reached the Pacific Ocean near the town of Ventura at 5:25 in the morning. The dark water of the ocean turned brown with silt and debris for miles. When the sun rose on March 13th, the scale of the devastation was incomprehensible. The Santa Clara River Valley looked like the surface of the moon. Citrus groves were buried under feet of thick, hardening mud. Bridges were twisted into scrap metal. Miles of highway were gone. And then there were the bodies. Rescue workers waded through the mud, digging frantically. They found victims trapped in the branches of trees. They found them buried under the silt. They found them washed up on the beaches of the Pacific. The official death toll was heavily contested. For decades, the number hovered around 431. However, modern historical research indicates the true toll was much higher. Many of the agricultural laborers living in the valley were transient Mexican immigrants whose presence was entirely undocumented. When their camps were washed away, there was no official record of their existence. Today, historians estimate the death toll was easily over 600. In Los Angeles, the news hit like an earthquake. The city was paralyzed by shock and then by fury. William Mulholland was devastated. He was an old man, 72 years old, and the structure he had personally designed and approved had just slaughtered hundreds of people. The investigations began immediately. The governor of California assembled a panel of independent engineers and geologists. The coroner of Los Angeles County convened a grand jury to determine criminal liability. Mulholland was called to the stand. The courtroom was packed. The once proud engineer, the man who had ordered rivers to move, looked shattered. He did not dodge responsibility. He did not blame his subordinates. "I have been entirely in charge of the water department," Mulholland testified, his voice trembling. "If there is any error in judgment, "I am the one to blame." When pressed about the inspection he had performed just hours before the collapse, Mulholland broke down. "The only ones I envy about this thing," he wept, "are the ones who are dead." The coroner's jury concluded that the dam failed due to a catastrophic misunderstanding of the geological foundation. The jury ruled that Mulholland had made a profound error in judgment. They noted that an enterprise affecting the lives of thousands of people should never be left to the sole judgment of one man, no matter how eminent. However, they did not recommend criminal charges. They determined that Mulholland had acted in good faith, blinded by his own experience and an antiquated approach to engineering. He had not intended to cause harm. He simply did not know what he did not know. Mulholland resigned in disgrace 7 months later. He retreated from public life, spending his final years in isolation. Friends said he never recovered. He died 7 years later, a broken man. The destruction of the St. Francis Dam forced a brutal reckoning, but from the mud and the tragedy, a profound transformation occurred, one that fundamentally altered the future of California and the entire American West. Before St. Francis, civil engineering in California was largely an unregulated frontier. Afterward, the state legislature passed the Dam Safety Act of 1929. For the first time, independent geological and engineering reviews were mandated for all dams. The disaster effectively ended the era of the self-taught, solitary engineer. It birthed the modern era of professional registration, geological testing, and rigorous safety oversight. But the tragedy had an even more massive impact on the physical geography of Los Angeles. At the time of the collapse, Mulholland had been lobbying for an even more ambitious project, a massive dam on the Colorado River to supply water and power to Southern California. Following the St. Francis disaster, Congress balked. They refused to let Mulholland anywhere near the Colorado River project. The federal government took over, mandating unprecedented independent reviews. That project eventually became the Hoover Dam, built with safety standards heavily influenced by the lessons of St. Francis. Locally, the loss of the St. Francis Reservoir put Los Angeles in a desperate position. Their water security was gone. The city could no longer rely solely on the Owens Valley, and it became painfully clear that a single city department could not manage the massive infrastructure required to sustain the region. To survive, Los Angeles was forced to form an unprecedented coalition with neighboring cities. This coalition became the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. The Metropolitan Water District undertook the monumental task of building the Colorado River Aqueduct, a project far larger than anything Mulholland had ever attempted. It was this water, flowing from the Colorado River, managed by a heavily regulated, multi-city agency, that truly allowed Southern California to explode into the post-war megalopolis we know today. The St. Francis Dam disaster was the bloody pivot point in the history of Los Angeles. The unregulated, single-minded drive of the pioneer era ended the night that dam collapsed. The modern, heavily engineered, bureaucratic reality of the 20th century was built in its aftermath. Los Angeles realized that ambition without oversight is indistinguishable from destruction. Today, if you drive up San Francisquito Canyon, you will find very little evidence of what happened. The road twists through the quiet mountains. A few massive chunks of white concrete still lie half buried in the brush, covered in graffiti and choked by weeds. The tombstone was dynamited by the city long ago to erase the grim reminder. Most drivers pass through without ever knowing they are driving across the grave of 600 people. But the legacy of the St. Francis Dam is not in the ruins. Its legacy is in every drop of water that flows through the faucets of modern Los Angeles. It is in the strict safety codes that protect communities living beneath dams worldwide. It is in the cold reality that the cities we build are only as permanent as the earth beneath them, and that nature ultimately has the final say.